But people talk about bailing out of an airplane. George Bush is the only person that I know of who successfully bailed out of a TBM. The only one. I've never heard of anyone successfully going out, because you had a very limited space to exit. You had to go out head first and hope that the tail didn't hit you, which it did him. And so you had a lot of things going against you, but I was never tempted to jump.
How many landings did you make, aircraft carrier landings and takeoffs?
Approximately 70. A lot of them were catapult shots, where the airplane was stationed on the catapult. And if anyone wants interested in thrills, you go from a dead stop to about 110 miles an hour in a little over 100 feet. So your head is planted against the headrest, you're full throttle, full right rudder, full nose down, and they blast you off into the air, and immediately upon becoming airborne, you have to reverse everything in order to maintain flight. So you start rolling tabs and pulling up flaps and doing all this stuff in the matter of split seconds, and also making a fast right turn so your slipstream doesn't catch the airplane behind you. So it's but you practice. You know, it's like the old cliche about the guy who's in New York and he's looking for Carnegie Hall, and he goes up to the cop and he says, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And he said, "Practice, practice, practice."
So incredible. How many missions did you fly then in the second one?
Well, according to my logbook, I flew 25. But according to one of my shipmates, there were several others that he was told were counted as missions, even though we didn't engage the enemy, like flying anti-submarine patrols and things like that. So he claimed that we did close to 70 missions.
Okay. You can put the picture down if you want.
Okay.
Thanks for that overview. Now let's go back a little bit to your youth, if that's okay. So were you born in St. Paul?
Born in St. Paul in 1923. And the neighborhood that I grew up in, the Regions Hospital is sitting right on top of where my house used to be. I attended Mechanic Arts High School. I graduated in 1940. And then, of course, in 1941, the war broke out. I was engaged in my Sunday ritual with a buddy of mine who hung out at a pool hall in downtown St. Paul called Bilbo's. And anyone who was born and raised in St. Paul is familiar with Bilbo's. And we were there on Sunday, December 7th, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And both of us had already registered for the draft, because I turned 18 in September and he did a week before me. And so then we were either had the choice of going in the Army or the Navy or something before we were drafted. My recollections of World War I were not too great. I grew up in I was a World War I baby 5 years after the end of World War I. And as I was growing up, I used to hear all these stories about trench warfare and hand-to-hand combat. And I knew that wasn't for me. And so I always loved flying, always loved flying. So one day I started out to try to join the Army Air Corps.
And when was this?
This was in 1942.
1942. Okay.
Yeah, this was approximately July of 1942. So in order to join the Army Air Corps, I had to take the streetcar from St. Paul to Minneapolis, because that's where the recruiting station was. So I walked into the pool hall, and I was dressed a little better than I usually dressed. And I bumped into an old buddy of mine, Red Fogarty, and he asked me where I was going. and I told him I was on my way to try to join the Army Air Corps, which it was known as in those days, but prior to becoming the Air Force. And he said, "Oh, why do you want to do that?" He said, "You should join the Navy." He said, "They are the most elite group," and he reached in his pocket and pulled out a card showing that he had enlisted in the V5 program leading to becoming a naval aviator. So instead of going over to the Army Air Corps, I opted for the Navy. In the interim, while I was going through my training and finally graduated, I came home on leave. He had washed out of training and was now a sailor in the Navy.
See what happens?
So that's how I wound up in the Navy.
Let's go back to December 741 for a second.
Okay.
Well, do you have a vivid recollection of that day?
Oh yes,
Okay.
yeah. We used to go to the, as I indicated, Bilbo's on Sunday. That was our ritual. And not that we shot so much pool, but we used to like to watch the pool sharks and gather around the table and watch the real pros. And the announcement came over. They had a teletype there that they used to bring in baseball scores all the time and football scores. It was back before the days, of course, of television and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, a message came over the teletype that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese Navy or Air Force. And so I looked at my buddy and he looked at me, and of course we knew within minutes that this was going to involve us. We were already registered for the draft. We both turned 18, and he in the end of August, and my September 5th was my birthday. And so he eventually wound up in the Navy, and he was on a destroyer when we were attacking the Jap fleet that day. And their orders were, if we didn't knock out the Japanese fleet, they were supposed to attack them. We reminisced after the war, which was kind of a strange coincidence.
Do you recall what you did later in the day? Did you go home and see your parents? Were you living with your parents at the time?
I was living at home
Okay.
with my parents, and I hadn't really made up my mind about what I was going to do. And then I had pretty much talked to my folks. My brothers were both 4F. They didn't have to go into the service. One had a heart condition, the other had a crippled hand. And so I finally decided I wasn't going to wait for the draft. And I was going to opt for the Air Corps. I always loved to fly.
Do you have a recollection of President Roosevelt's speech the next day? The
Oh,
Declaration of
sure.
War?
Yeah, we all listened to it. You know, Roosevelt was like God in those days, you know, with his fireside chats and all that. And oh, I'll never forget that speech.
Were you at home when you listened, or where did you listen?
I was at home, yes. My father was an amateur radio maker,